So we're having a major firefight going on now for many, many hours in Jenin in Northern Samaria, and the Biden administration is condemning Israel. For details and my own news breakdown, stay tuned. Hi, welcome back. So in the early morning hours of Monday, around 4 o'clock in the morning, IDF forces went into the Northern Samaria town of Jenin in order to arrest two terrorists, one from Hamas and one from Islamic Jihad. And these were special forces from the Border Guard unit and paratroopers, apparently. And they went in their vehicles, and they were attacked by a roadside bomb, Lebanon style. I think it was a Claymore bomb from what they're saying now. And one of the vehicle, the lead vehicle, drove into it or over it, and 7 IDF forces, 5 border policemen, and 2 paratroopers were wounded in various degrees. And then right after the blast, which was enormous, you can see it in the background, they were beset by massive gunfire from buildings all around them in order to try to clear the scene, in order to evacuate the wounded. For the first time in over 20 years, the Air Force was deployed to Samaria, and an Air Force helicopter shot up apparently an empty area. At any rate, the evacuation of the other vehicles that were trapped essentially out by the bomb blast and weren't able to move is taking several hours, and the evacuation is happening under constant fire. This is a kind of scene that the IDF saw in Lebanon. It's not the kind of thing that we've seen in the past in Judea and Samaria, but I think it's part of a greater escalation that we're seeing. So on March 13th, Israel was stunned by a Claymore mine IED roadside bomb on the Megiddo Junction, which is a major traffic artery in northern Israel in the Lower Galilee, about 80 kilometers from the border with Lebanon. And then after a couple of weeks of investigation, the IDF concluded that it was a Hezbollah operative that had penetrated Israel from South Lebanon, entered Israel, traveled 80 kilometers south, and laid down the bomb. And it was just because he apparently detonated it incorrectly or wrongly. Only one person was killed, but really the effect of that IED was supposed to be massive. And as you can see in the video of what happened in Jenin, this was quite a blast in Northern Samaria. So I think what we're seeing is that what happened in March in Israel proper is happening now in Samaria. And as the central control of the PA disappears completely, you have Iranian-controlled terrorist organization, the Islamic Jihad, working in conjunction with Hamas and with Palestinian Authority officers. Perhaps, I don't know whether or not they're part of a command chain or not, but certainly there are a lot of senior PA officers trained by the United States, by the way, who are also involved in this, and they're rapidly escalating the capabilities of Palestinian terror cells in Jenin, in Shechem, Nablus, and in other villages in northern Samaria. And these are manifesting themselves both in what we saw Monday morning and throughout the day on Monday in Jenin, in the firefight between IDF forces and Palestinian terrorist forces, and also in the escalating terrorist attacks against Israeli civilians, most notably in the town of Hawara, which is also in the area. And one of the things that the residents of Northern Samaria have been saying for a long time is that the escalating violence against Israeli civilians is enabled by the IDF's decision a few years ago, operating under U.S. pressure, to remove roadblocks from major traffic arteries that serve Jews and Arabs. And just to be clear, roadblocks stop everybody. So Israeli Jews are stopped at roadblocks. Israeli Arabs are stopped at roadblocks. Palestinian Arabs are stopped at roadblocks. Everybody has to wait, sometimes for a very long time. But because of the roadblocks, the IDF is able to control to a certain degree what's happening and to inspect and to interdict terrorist traffic on the roads that then is used against Jews. And we just had, another murderous terrorist attack at Hawara Junction or at Khermesh, a nearby town, a week and a half ago. And we've had repeated terrorist attacks at Hawara, and there is no roadblock there. The IDF keeps saying that they don't want to restore roadblocks because it's enough for them to go into the towns in the nighttime and interdict terrorists. But as we keep seeing repeatedly, it's not true. You have IDF commanders on the scene today telling their colleagues, look, we're all special forces and we can do our thing, but we're facing an enemy that can only be put down by air power and by tanks, and we're not tanks. We're, some of it is heavy artillery, but these are not armored forces, and that's really what you need right now when you're facing the kind of the equipped enemy that we're facing in Jenin and the kind of organized assault on IDF forces that we're seeing on the ground, and the aggregation of pretty significant explosive devices and the capacity to use them, both in terms of, skill, training, and deployment capabilities. So this is all something that marks a significant escalation. And again, I said it in passing, but we have to understand that what's happening right now on the ground in the Palestinian Authority areas, the major cities, particularly in Northern Samaria, but not only, it's true to a lesser but significant degree in all the other major towns and cities in Judea and Samaria that are under Palestinian Authority control. And remember, 99% of Palestinians in Judea and Samaria live under the control of the Palestinian Authority. So this is the Palestinians writ large. The Palestinian Authority itself is almost insignificant as a governing authority in Judea and Samaria these days. Certainly in Northern Samaria, it exerts no security control over the towns in Judea, in Samaria, particularly Jenin and Nablus, but also to a degree in Tul Karam and others. So, and that vacuum is being filled by Hamas and Islamic Jihad, and again by Fatah fighters, PA officers who are working either outside the chain of command of the Palestinian Authority or with nodding assent, the wink and the nod of the Palestinian Authority, enabling them to go forward. But why are they doing this? Why is it that they're all escalating their operations against Israeli forces and Israeli civilians? And the answer is this is part of the succession battle. Mahmoud Abbas, the chairman of the PLO and of the Palestinian Authority, is ailing. He was in China this past week, and reports were that as soon as he touched down in China, he was hospitalized again because he's really sick. And then he later met with a Chinese leader and attacked Israel, et cetera, et cetera. But he's very sick. And the fact that he's still alive is a surprise to a lot of people. At any rate, he's widely expected to pass away sometime in the near future. And the way that the Palestinians determine who's going to succeed him is not by fighting each other, it's by escalating their attacks against Jews, because the people who kill the most Jews, whether in the IDF or Israeli civilians, are the most revered characters and actors in Palestinian society, so that to the extent that you want to gain public legitimacy, it's not at the ballot box, and it's not, George W. Bush's theory, his pothole theory of democracy, that, the fact that, you're in government means you're going to have to moderate because people expect municipal services, et cetera, and, for the government to fix their potholes. No. Palestinian society is a mobilized society. It's mobilized at its sort of its own definition of itself. It has no positive concept of what it means to be a Palestinian nationalism is predicated on the negation of the Jewish nation and the appropriation of Jewish history, heritage, culture, and rights to the Palestinians. They don't have any independent existence without hatred of Israel. They don't have any sort of positive concept of what it means to be a Palestinian. It's all in relation to negating Israel's right to exist. So in order to win a succession battle for Palestinian leadership, given the deformity or the pathologies of the Palestinian national identity, it's very clear that the way that you do it is by killing Jews, and killing Jews in or out of uniform. And the more that you kill, the more capable you are of killing Jews, the more likely you are to be the heir to the throne, as the throne itself is vacated by Mahmoud Abbas, who's in such bad shape, medically speaking, and very old to boot. So that's what's happening now, and the succession crisis itself, or the expectation of succession crisis, is one of the main engines behind what's happening. Another engine behind what's happening is the rise of Iran. Ehud Yari, who is one of Israel's most seasoned Arab affairs analysts, wrote an article this week where he essentially said, in brief, that Israel, aside from the Syrian people themselves, Israel is the biggest loser of the Syrian civil war because by maintaining power, Bashar Assad, Syrian dictator Bashar Assad, and not being ousted by the forces inside of Syrian society that were trying to oust him, particularly the Sunnis, Bashar Assad essentially transformed Syria into another Iranian colony. So just as Lebanon operates at the pleasure of the Iranian regime and is its foreign legion in Lebanon, and it wages Iran's war against Israel on all of Lebanon because Hezbollah controls Lebanon. So Assad, who owes his survival in office to Iran and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, he too has transformed Syria after the civil war into yet another Iranian base of operations against Israel, another forward base of operations. So, and with the rise of Iran comes the rise of terrorism all around Israel, the heating up of all of the fronts at Israel's doorstep. And Khamenei and other Iranian regime leaders have been escalating their rhetoric about the need to expand terrorist operations in Judea and Samaria. And so I think what we're seeing in Janine is an expression not only of the succession battle, which is to escalate everybody's violence against Israel, but also we're seeing the expression of the will of the Iranian regime to escalate terrorism in Judea and Samaria now. That's what they're calling for. Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas, but the Islamic Jihad itself is just a creature of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps that established the terrorist organization in 1988. Hamas increasingly is also acting at the pleasure of Tehran. So what we're seeing in Northern Samaria, and specifically in the town of Jenin, is an expression of both of these trends. And that brings us to the statement this morning, I think just like an hour before the violence began in Janine, and it was Matthew Miller, the State Department spokesman. I'm just bringing up his quote. So it says here that the United States is deeply troubled, not by, the rise in tension in the Palestinian Authority or the linkage between Hezbollah terrorists from Lebanon and Palestinian terrorists in Samaria. No, and granted, this was apparently a statement that he made an hour or two before the fighting started in Jenin, but he says that the United States is deeply troubled by the Israeli government's intention to plan more than 4,000 settlement units in the West Bank. We are similarly concerned by reports of changes to Israel's system of settlement administration that expedite the planning and approval of settlements. And he added that the U.S. opposes such unilateral actions that make the two-state solution more difficult to achieve and are an obstacle to peace. He said of the planned construction, he continued, "We call on the government of Israel to fulfill the commitments it made in Aqaba, Jordan, and Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, and return to dialogue aimed at de-escalation." So this is an interesting statement because facing this system of Iranian-controlled and directed terrorism, both from Lebanon, Syria, and Gaza, of course, and increasingly from Northern Samaria, and facing the chaos in the Palestinian Authority, where there's not only does the Palestinian Authority reject a two-state solution, that is a Palestinian state that's going to live side by side at peace with Israel, but none of the leaders of Palestinian society and any of the factions of Palestinian society, including the ones that are rising now as Mahmoud Abbas, the PLO chief and the PLO leader, heads for the grave, none of them accept the basis of the two-state solution as the Americans conceive it. I mean, I conceive it a little bit differently, but the Americans conceive it, at least in theory, as the Palestinians have limited demands on Israel, and Israel just has to satisfy those limited territorial demands, and then we're going to be able to have peaceful coexistence between two states. That's not how anybody in the Palestinian Authority who's in a position to succeed Mahmoud Abbas, whether from inside of the PLO or from outside of the PLO, sees reality. And so the American position here, especially now that we're seeing this firefight, going on and on and on in Jenin, is completely divorced from reality. It's based on this ideological conviction that the problem in the region, the source of the conflict between the Palestinians and Israel is Israel, and particularly the Israeli right. But not only, Israel itself is a problem because, Israel won't cough up sufficient territory to give to the Palestinians. And by the way, stemming from this narrative that it's Israeli land greed that's preventing peace as opposed to the Palestinian rejection of Israel's right to be here, it all kind of emanates from this fake Palestinian narrative that says that the Jews are colonialist interlopers and that today's Jews are not the descendants of the Jews of the Bible, when literally every corner of this land screams out the opposite, as does, every synagogue all over the world. And you simply cannot make this argument with a straight face, and yet that's the basis of Palestinian political warfare against Israel, that statements like the United States State Department's condemnation of Israel's decision to allow another 4,000 units to go up for Jews in Judea and Samaria and to make it easier to give formal, building licenses to Jews in Judea and Samaria in the future, that's a really bad thing and that it's worthy not only of condemnation. And this wasn't condemnation in response to a question. Matthew Miller said this, unbidden. I mean, it wasn't in response to anything. This was an initiative of the State Department to attack Israel in the briefing. So, this is a delusional policy. It's entirely ideological. There's nothing here that's based at all on reality on the ground, and it makes it difficult as a practical matter for Israel to have a rational conversation with the Americans. Because now what's going to happen, and it's been building for several months, is that as the Palestinians have expanded their terrorist operations, and this has been going back for already over a year, from the towns of Northern Samaria, specifically from Jenin and from Shechem, you have increased calls from the Israelis who are being victimized and being, their communities and their residents are being attacked on the roads because of this escalation of terrorist capabilities and operations against Jews, civilians, and IDF forces. So the citizens of Samaria have been calling for Israel to carry out a very significant land operation to clean out the terror nests that have formed and expanded in Janine and Shechem and in the other big towns in Northern Samaria, so that people can go back to having a normal life. And so far, the IDF has opposed this because they're of this idea that we really have to be able to adapt our policy to please the Americans. But when you look at just how divorced from reality the American position really is, you understand that there's no point in trying to make Israel's policy palatable to the Biden administration, because nothing that we do is going to be palatable to the Biden administration we're paying over and over again, not because of anything that we do specifically that's stabilizing the region or escalating violence, as they accuse Israel of doing, or blocking peace, they're attacking us because their policy is based on the delusion that we're responsible for the absence of peace, and that there's some causal link between building homes for Jews in Judea and Samaria lawfully, of course, and Palestinian violence. And there is none, because this is just the nature of the beast. The Palestinians define themselves by their war against Israel, and the more war you wage against Israel, the more powerful you are in Palestinian society. So the Americans are just completely cut off from reality in their response to events, in their assessment of the Middle East, in their assessment of the Palestinians, and in their assessment of Israel. And so, I think it's very important. Prime Minister Netanyahu had a very good interview with, I think it was Sky News last week, where he was explaining, look, the Palestinians are trying to disappear Jewish history and heritage by, he didn't say this, but I say this, by laying waste to Jewish archaeological sites throughout Judea and Samaria. And meanwhile, you have George Knoll, who's the U.S. envoy to the Palestinians through the embassy. He's going around Judea and Samaria with Palestinian Authority officials and praising them for their archaeological sites, which are all fake. They take Christian sites and they pretend that they're not predicated on Jewish sites, which they all are, and ignoring the history and pretending that this is a Palestinian heritage site. So he does that because they're embracing this Palestinian narrative, and the Palestinian narrative is based not only on a negation and a denial and a physical erasure of Jewish history, but also the appropriation of that history to the Palestinians, which is just the most anti-Semitic thing anybody can do, because not only do you want to annihilate physically the Jewish state, but you want to erase Jewish past as well. So it's Jews present by killing us, and it's Jews in the past by erasing the historical reality of Jews. And then finally, philosophically, by telling Jews that anti-Zionism, which is particularly it's the cultural appropriation of Jewish heritage, history, and rights to the Palestinians, who have no cultural heritage and rights in this land, and saying that Jewish history is actually Palestinian history, but saying that if you do that, and you say that Jews have no right to this land, that's not anti-Semitic, right? That's what they're saying. They say, oh, you can't say that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism because it's just a political position. But of course it's not. It's like a whole full spectrum assault on Jewish identity, Jewish physical well-being, the Jewish state, Jewish rights, Jewish civil rights. It's like a full spectrum assault on Jews. And then they say that this most pernicious and full-throated assault against the Jewish people, that's not anti-Semitic. So, but the American policy is based on swallowing whole all of the basic foundations of this view, which is why you have George Knoll running around Judea and Samaria pretending that he's looking at Palestinian heritage sites, and why you have the State Department attacking Israel for allowing Jews to lawfully build their homes in Judea and Samaria, and why the United States really doesn't have anything helpful to say about Palestinian terrorism and violence, because if they were predicating their policies on reality, then they wouldn't be attacking Israel for those things. And since they want to attack Israel for all of these things, like building homes for Jews, and pretending that that's a major obstacle to peace, rather than a Palestinian national myth that's based on seizing Jewish history for itself and denying Jewish history for the Jews, this is where they end up. So Israel has to explain itself. It had, like Prime Minister Netanyahu did. He said, you can't say, that Jews have no right to Judea. I mean, where did we come from? We come from Judea, obviously, and the idea that we're colonial occupiers is crazy. And so, we like America very much. They're a very close ally, but they're wrong on this issue, and that's true. And I think that's the way forward. But also we need for our IDF commanders to recognize that really, the truth is coming from the field, and the people in Northern Samaria are not saying that they want a major ground operation in their neighborhood because they're they're warmongers are saying it because they want to be able to drive to work without getting killed. That's what they want. They want to reduce the threat to their lives and to their communities and to their fellow Jews, in Judea and Samaria, and particularly here in Northern Samaria, in the face of a rapidly escalating Palestinian terror threat. So I think that, we may be looking towards that kind of operation in Northern Samaria soon. And in the meantime, we just have to deal with the fact. I just read you the CNN headline here of what happened in Janine. What does it say? Huge firefight erupts as Israeli forces raid Jenin, leaving 4 Palestinians dead. So you see, they came in, they're ambushed with an IED, the likes of which we hadn't experienced in the past. 5 vehicles are stuck there, and we need to shoot from a helicopter for the first time in over 20 years in the area in order to evacuate wounded, and yet, this is what we get. Oh, and the Palestinians, by the way, are saying this is the new Stalingrad and that Israel is carrying out a massacre. So that's what's happening. Obviously, you cannot base a policy that'll get you anywhere good on anything other than reality. So come here to get your dose of reality from me. Make sure that you've subscribed to my show and to all of the channels, the Carolyn Glick Show and jns.org. And we'll see you here again next week. And by the way, my guest this week in the Carolyn Glick Show is Professor Ann Bayevsky, and we're going to talk about the anti-Semitic madness that is, or madhouse that is, the United Nations, and what's happening there, and how we should be looking at all of the things that are happening there. Iran, just a spoiler alert, they were elected to be the head of the Social Committee of the UN Human Rights Council, and they had a special exhibition on women's fashion in Iran. So that's just a little bit of a spoiler for what comes next. But in the meantime, have a great day. And remember, reality has to be our guide. Otherwise, we're going to go nowhere good. Take care.